Chapter 11. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. Sitting by the pond at the center of the library, Diane immediately began poring through the books Libro helped him get. Although Diane's memory was never photographic, he was still proud of it. If he, at any point, understood a topic, it would be unlikely that he would forget it. This was something that helped him greatly in the mortal world where he often spent much of his days coding. That said, this was taken to an all-new level with the speed reading technique. By using the Sapientia family's technique, Diane was able to understand the will of the books he wanted to read without even opening the cover. This essentially led to an even deeper understanding than he could have gained by normal methods. As such, the things he learned were engraved into his brain. As long as he put them to practice, he would be unlikely to ever lose this knowledge. If he could gain a cultivation method, his capacity to use the technique would increase. He may even be able to speed read multiple high-level books at a time. Diane was in awe of the knowledge he was gaining. Array alchemy allowed a myriad of things, from setting up protection and slaughter arrays to grafting together simple plants to form more complex ones. Even just one aspect led to infinite possibilities. For example, scientifically speaking, grafting meant using special means to splice the DNA of various plants together to form a new plant sharing the properties of the grafted DNA, or even creating all new properties not shared by any of the plants used to create it. By using the Martial World's methods, the new plant would even be available immediately without the growth or wait time. Obviously, grafting was a solely array alchemy-based concept. This was because it required knowledge of formations to break down and meld plants together safely. However, formation masters obviously never had any use for plants. They focused more so on concepts of feng shui and memorized what symbols capable of altering the laws of the universe in a finite space. No wonder why no one wants to join this faction. The complexity is without bounds. Theoretically, there's an infinite amount of knowledge to gain, which means any regular student would never feel like they made any real progress. But this only made Diane smile. He had always hated biology, but this perspective on it was completely new and intriguing to him. It lit a fire under him that he had only felt when he was training or sitting behind a computer screen. There was something that made Diane even more excited, though. He technically might not need to read the books on the highest levels of the library. He found that the avenue for applying mortal world knowledge to the martial world was boundless. These so-called common grade plants, at the very least the lower common grade ilk, could be found in the mortal world. This must be hard to do for other array alchemists because they don't have the human world knowledge that I have. Plus, the knowledge that I don't have. Diane looked down at his twin silver bracelets with an excited glint in his eye. I can always look it up. This thought gave Diane a new level of understanding. Both the martial and mortal world had their own advantages. Although he didn't understand why his world was devoid of energy, it was good that his experiences could still help him. Since they wanted to look down on commoners, he'd use his commoner knowledge to get a leg up. Before Diane even noticed, 2 days had passed by before he finished speed reading the hundreds of books on common plants. This was when Diane noticed a problem with his speed reading method. I have all of this knowledge, but it isn't organized. It's almost like if I want to recall something, I have to close my eyes and re-read the hundreds of volumes I just went through to find the answer. This isn't good. The knowledge I've gained is useless like this. Frustrated, Diane carried the books back to the wooden desk in sets of 10. What a waste of 2 days. I'm tired as all hell and I smell horrible. Diane had long since taken off his previously unbuttoned dress shirt and switched his rolled-up jeans for a pair of gray sweats, but he still felt uncomfortable. Diane looked up as the monitor flickered. You seem tired. Libro pinched his nose. I can almost smell you from here. Go rest. I'll let you take the books on array theory with you. Diane flicked his wrist, too tired to answer. He created a new folder called Array Theory and slotted the other set of hundreds of books into his storage bands. What an interesting device. Doesn't seem very efficient though. Libro snickered. Yeah. I'm sure you know what problems I'm having. Do you have a solution? In terms of your need for rest and showers, those won't be resolved until you reach a higher cultivation level. Your brain's capacity is still too weak to go without rest. In terms of the speed reading technique, I'm sure a genius like you will figure it out. Libro smiled deviously. I can't just give him all the answers, this is my family's secret technique after all. If I wasn't Crystal Glass's level, I'd be afraid of being killed for even thinking of giving him this technique. My only saving grace is that I didn't give him the full technique. Diane sighed. Fine, I guess. Thank for your help, this would probably have been a lot harder without you. Libro was a bit surprised by Diane's sincere thanks, but he took it in stride as he watched Diane sluggishly head towards his dorm room. On the top floor of the center pillar, the family heads met in a spacious office. Reminiscent of the ceremony hall, the room was filled with somber light. A fireplace raged off to the right, flickering soft embers that lit the dark room. Drapes of maroon covered the large windows, resonating with the dark wood floor. A large desk partially hid Neva's figure as he faced away from the other family heads and towards the covered windows. The other family heads sat on black couches surrounding the fireplace, letting silence reign the room. Chapter 12. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Cammy was the first to speak, fury coating his words. I won't let this stand. My boy still hasn't recovered. Disregarding the pain he's been in, the expense of the medicine needed to ensure these wounds would have no impact on his future is astronomical. Don't act rashly, Cammy. If your boy hadn't tried to kill the commoner, he would have never suffered. Neva's voice was understanding but firm. He couldn't allow Cammy's hate to fester. I don't care. Since when has the Cammy family ever needed permission to kill? He'll pay for this humiliation. Duco spoke. Don't forget why he gained the quota to perform in the first place, Cammy. The boy may be mediocre here, but he is of great value to the commoners. In fact, he's quite the celebrity in the mortal world. If they learn of him being killed, and especially so soon after coming to us, it will start a war. Duco is right, we have other issues to deal with. Warring with the commoners is not something we can afford, and it seems like the boy knows this. Plus, considering the dangerous missions Focus Academy's students undergo from the 4th grade onwards, he might just die naturally. Bai spoke out in agreement. Sapientia's light laughter filled the room in hopes of cutting through the tension. From what I can garner, this boy might not continue to be mediocre for long. He said in reply to Duco's comment. I see that our resident librarian has already taken a liking to him. What? Cammy's anger spiked. The importance of the library to this school couldn't be understated. If Diane somehow managed to get Libro to his side as a mentor or friend, his progress would be much faster. Not to worry, Cammy, Libro wouldn't break the rules of the academy. Although, it seems that Neva's daughter gave the boy access to the first 600 levels for a few hours. Delia's father stiffened at these words. Cammy sighed in relief. No one could do anything with just a few hours, even with access to 600 levels. I wouldn't be too relieved if I were you. It seems like one of the techniques he learned was my clan speed reading technique. Learned. Don't play with us, Sapientia. You just said he only had a few hours, what do you mean learned? And such a high level technique at that. Storm said, breaking his silence. Sapientia sighed. It seems he has quite some affinity for my clan's techniques. You know, the mortal world has always fascinated me. Their capacity for thinking and research is in some ways far beyond our own. Cammy's fists tightened. In reality, it seemed odd for experts of their stature to be so concerned with a boy. However, there were very strict taboos on the interaction between the martial and mortal world. The ceremonial talent check they allowed the mortal world every 5 years was never meant to actually turn out any talents. They couldn't understand how Diane had passed. Pasha. Neva's voice rang out. The larger school alliances are putting too much pressure on us. We may have many promising geniuses in this generation, but past years have only had maybe 1 or 2. If we want this school to survive, and thereby secure the future of our families, we shouldn't be ostracizing geniuses. The boy is intelligent. It wouldn't be difficult for him to find out that there would be other schools willing to recruit him. Schools more willing to ignore the taboos. I suggest we move away from a plan to stifle him ourselves. The students of this school will be more than enough to do that. That way, if he succeeds despite that, we have a genius. If he fails, then we'd have gotten rid of a problem. We have other matters to attend to, such as preparing our family's geniuses for the Alliance ranking tournament and, although Pasha. Neva didn't speak the last parts of his thoughts, the other family heads knew fully well what he was referring to. Aside from this, the truth was that the family heads only acted against Diane because it was the easiest and most direct way. If he was embarrassed into leaving without them having to lift a finger, it would have been their best case scenario. They had no way of guessing he'd have met Delia to give him access to the library, or even that he'd be able to learn what he learned in such a short time. Cammy swallowed his anger, choosing to believe his son would get his own revenge. As the pressure in the room subsided, the family heads nodded in resolve. It wasn't worth it to act themselves. They knew that Diane would be slowed by his own lack of resources. In fact, he wouldn't even be afforded a decent cultivation technique since the one demonstrated in the coming classes would be the most basic and crude version possible. Even the family heads didn't know what calamities lay ahead of them. All they knew was that power trumps everything. And right now, they didn't have enough of it. Chapter 13. You are listening at novelfull.audio. For those of you who have read to this point already, I made a mistake. I planned this novel's changes to include the MC being 16, not 13. Accidentally forgot to change this. From now on, Diane is 16 years old and 1.9 meters tall. Diane's feet dragged across the floor as he weaved through the bustling pillar. As far as he knew, there were 6 sub-pillars and a center one. Each of the 6 sub-pillars were named after the pillar families, and Diane was just lucky enough to be assigned a dorm in the Pasha, Neva pillar. Hopefully this means I can avoid too much trouble for the time being. Aside from this moment of temporary relief, something else confused Diane. There were just too many students. Are their families really this large? If they're all really part of the pillar families, this is going to be harder than I thought. Diane finally made it to the other half of the pillar after descending to the bottom floor. The large space narrowed into a hallway that led into a lounging area. A pond identical to the one in the library graced the center, allowing a few students to meditate around it on the available platforms. Looking at the water, it didn't seem to be water at all. Diane hadn't paid much attention to it before, but the pond gave off an ethereal feel. The substance inside it ebbed and flowed, but seemed to have no real mass. It was almost like a gas sometimes, and other times like a liquid. But, its most defining characteristic was its golden color. What an interesting pond. It would have to be artificial for it to be here, but it seems so real, Diane thought in a trance. He walked slowly to the edge and stretched out his hand to dip it in. What are you doing, BVEC? Diane snapped out of his trance to see a tall red-headed girl with her hands on her curved hips. The influx of tight leather cleared up his cloudy vision instantly. Are you trying to get yourself killed? You clearly have no cultivation and you clearly see no one else around you touching the energy currents, but you think a first year like you can. You must be trying really hard to implode from the inside out. You should already know about the dangers of the ponds. It's the first thing they teach you at orientation, and it should be something you would have learned even before coming here. In fact, why aren't you wearing your student-issued robes? What about your emblem? Faction affiliation. Do you even go here? Diane didn't seem to be listening, his eyes kept scanning over the voluptuous woman in front of him. Diane had never been one with any real tact, coupled with his immaturity he stood no chance against the girl in front of him. That wasn't even considering that fact she was wearing tight leather short shorts and a crop top. I sure am glad I came to this academy, Diane said while finally looking up from his daze, ignoring the fact this girl was nagging him despite clearly not wearing a uniform herself. PFT, you're so weak yet you have time to think of frivolous things. Remove me from your thoughts, you think I'd want a man who I could beat without lifting a single finger. Snickers filled the lounge as a group of 3 male students wearing yellow robes reminiscent of traditional Chinese Chang Pao. Do you need us to handle this weakling, Ava? Ava looked over in disgust. Clearly not. Diane seemed unbothered by what was going on as he continued to smile, beat me without lifting a finger. Maybe so. But, what if I beat you? Would that be enough for you to take me as your man? Ava turned to Diane and raised an eyebrow. Diane continued as if not sensing the 3 boys staring daggers at the side of his face. Probably not, right? Although I know nothing much about this school, I'm fairly certain that you aren't the strongest. If being stronger than you was all it took, wouldn't you already have a man? So why not overlook my weakness and have a chat with me? Even the hostility of the 3 boys was stifled as silence reigned the lounge. Whispers came soon after. First he tried to kill himself with the pond and now he's messing with Ava. Does this kid have a death wish? He's new, he clearly doesn't know what's going on. What an idiot, I hope you enjoyed your barely over a decade-old life. With Ava's temper, she really might kill you personally. Not the strongest. Maybe. But that's only because of her age. Obviously she meant being stronger than her while being of her grade. Who does he think he is? Finally, the leader of the 3 boys couldn't hold back anymore and charged forward. This is Ava Sicarius, she ranks amongst the top 1 of last year's juniors, and you dare flirt with her. Who are you? What is your family name? Who gave you such courage? Diane flicked his wrists. A metal skateboard without wheels appeared, allowing him to hop onto it. He shot into the air, just out of reach. Ava's eyes glowed with curiosity. Although he's weak, he sure has some interesting things on him. He may be quite smart too, Darius wouldn't dare jump at him while he's hovering over the pond. If he missed, that would mean his death. I guess he isn't just a handsome face. Come down here and fight like a man. Darius boomed in anger. The truth was that he was a little flustered. He had never seen the device Diane had pulled out. It was impossible for cultivators to fly until they reached the legendary Essence Gatherer realm. But there wasn't even a single such expert in the whole of this academy. The only exception were beast tamers who happened to tame winged creatures, but due to the danger of such a thing, only high-ranking beast masters would dare to risk taking a beast into the air for fear of dying. No thank you, you seem a bit angry and I'm weak, remember. But if Miss Ava wanted to come up with me, I wouldn't mind. Diane said with a smile. A devilish smile appeared on Ava's face as a wrapped whip appeared in her hand. I would love to come up with you, why don't you come down a bit? She doesn't look too happy, Diane thought with a shudder. I don't usually make it a point to disappoint beauties, but I'll have to make an exception today. I'll see you around, little Ava. A look of disdain appeared on Ava's face. Who are you calling little Ava? Unfurling her whip with an elegant flick, she shot a beam of energy directly at Diane's receding back, but, before it could reach him, it sent ripples across a translucent energy shield. That whip, something seems off, thought Diane. You're right in being agitated when I call you little Ava, Diane smirked lewdly, involuntarily stealing a glance at Ava's chest. It seemed it could pop the seams of her leather crop top at any moment. Big Ava is definitely more apropos, Diane shouted as he entered another hallway, riding quickly towards his room. Torrents of red flooded Ava's chest, as she heaved breaths in anger. I'll teach him a lesson soon enough. A cold wind made Diane shiver as he flew away. That was too close. Luckily the protection I built into this board is able to stop the energy they use, or else I'd be screwed. This hoverboard was one of Diane's personal inventions. The energy shield was actually meant to stop debris and air from affecting him when he flew at high speeds, but today it saved him from injury. That aside, it seems like there are other families in this school. But, most importantly, it seems like I missed orientation, so I have no clue what's going on. Damn it, Libro, you should have said something. Maybe the fact a pond with no warning labels could kill me would have been a nice tip to give. After weaving around aimlessly for a while and ensuring that no one followed him to his room, Diane finally came to a stop along a row of metal doors. After finding the one appropriately labeled for himself, he flashed his card along a panel before entering. A sea of blue assaulted his senses as he once again found himself looking at large panels of glass facing the focus lake. The room was decently sized at about 20 square meters. There was a bed, a meditation platform, a closet built into a side wall, as well as an empty bookcase. Diane was happy to find white robes lying on his bed. They looked exactly like the robes those three boys from earlier had on aside from the color. Maybe he had cursed Libro a little too soon. Diane pulled out a small metal disc and threw it at his door. That should protect me for the time being. Even if they find my room they shouldn't be able to get in. This'll allow me to practice and sleep in peace. Diane threw his robes into the closet while walking towards the one door he had yet to explore. Inside, he found a bathroom which he was quite content with. After a shower, he sat down to think about the past events. What intrigued him the most was the pond. It's odd, even in all of the basic books I've read, there was nothing about an energy-filled pond. And even if there was, why would it be dangerous to touch? I assume it might be because of an influx of energy my body wouldn't be able to handle. The truth of the matter wasn't far from what Diane thought. You could consider the energy in the pond as electricity, except in this case, the best conductor was the human body and not metal. If Diane had touched the pond without sufficient cultivation to handle the influx of energy, he would have imploded similar to a piece of metal heating up due to too much current. Diane shivered when he thought of this. Seems like I came quite close to dying today. I need to be more careful in the future. I'll also need to thank her properly. Setting aside his curiosity towards the pond and its origins, Diane slipped on some comfortable gray sweatpants and a new white shirt. Soon, he had hopped into bed and fallen into a deep sleep. Chapter 14. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Libro looked away from the computer monitor and sighed. It's going to be a really long road for him if he insists on continuing. Uncle, why are you so invested? You understand the divide between the mortal world and cultivation world better than anyone else. It's impossible for him to succeed. The fact he could even come here at all is a miracle enough. We can't possibly expect more. If Diane was there, he would have noted that the one who spoke was Pertinacis. He was currently giving his uncle an odd look. He didn't quite understand why his uncle was so interested in this Diane. Of course, Pertinacis had personally witnessed Diane's performance that day. But, after calmly analyzing what happened, he realized that the feat of defeating Mayumi definitely couldn't be replicated. And, likewise, he also concluded much like Diane did that the latter couldn't possibly lug around a piano everywhere, right? He wasn't exactly wrong in his assessment. The mortal world and the martial world shared the same planet, each on their own half, but they might as well have been from two completely different worlds. If it wasn't for the fact that the mortal world didn't have any cultivation energy, thus making it worthless in their eyes, the mortals would have already been wiped from existence long ago. Who knew how Diane even managed to awaken a small ability to cultivate? Pertinacis, how long did it take you to master the speed reading technique? Rather than answering the question, Libro asked another of his own. I haven't. Why would you ask me that, uncle? You know, only crystal-level family members have mastered the first level of the technique. Clearly, I haven't even reached that level, let alone mastered it. You should tease someone else if you're bored. Pertinacious had always been like this. He was a very by-the-books type of person. He didn't even seem embarrassed as he spoke, just stating the fact casually. It took Diane less than an hour to reach a rudimentary understand of the first level, and that was only because that was the only part of the technique I gave him. If he was in our family, he'd already be crystal level. What? Pertinacious looked to his uncle in shock. Libro seemed to get some satisfaction from watching his stoic nephew finally show a hint of emotion. He didn't act his age at all. An unassuming girl at the corner of the monitoring room looked up from her book. She had her brunette hair was up in a bun, her golden eyes were sparkling through her carbon-framed glasses. She wore a cheongsam that was a beautiful purple with white lilies. It clung to her thighs closely, outlining her perfect figure. Her lips were full, painted with a bright red that complemented her fair skin. Her beauty was, without a doubt, beyond words, as if her mere presence placed untold pressure on the world around her to worship and praise. Somehow, though, this beauty seemed to be dulled due to her slightly pale appearance. The young girl's gentle voice spoke out. You gave the technique to him, uncle. Hearing such a question, Libro couldn't help but blush slightly. I did. I'm embarrassed to say that the only reason was because he asked for it. I found it quite impressive that someone who had never had contact with the martial world before would be able to assume such a technique existed, so I gave him a chance. Never did I think he'd actually be able to master it in such a short time. His talent is astounding. Father might not be too pleased about that, the girl in purple replied lightly. I've never seen you so worried about a boy, my dear Madeline. Madeline didn't seem too embarrassed by what her uncle was saying. She only smiled lightly, her aura like a refreshing dew. Unlike her younger brother, Pertinacious, she had the calm sort of temperament that wasn't afraid to open itself up to the world. A soft laughter filled the room. You're always so intent on playing matchmaker, uncle. But, of course, there's nothing I want to see more than my beautiful nieces with a worthy man. Nieces. Did you have another one? Madeline said, laughing again. Libro looked over mysteriously. Our little Princess Delia, and the little fox Maying, seemed to be interested in him as well. Delia, sitting across from Madeline and next to Maying, looked over. Don't joke around like that, Uncle Libro. We're only friends. Maying giggled as she continued fiddling with a strange compass she had in front of her. Madeline looked over at them questioningly. Don't look at me like that, big sister, how could I be with a man weaker than me? We should stand as equals, at the very least. Running around, chasing skirts like that without having any power of his own. It's pathetic. Plus, even if he was that strong, I have no interest in that sort of thing, Delia said, rolling her eyes. Libro clicked his tongue. I don't know if you're right about that, Delia. Chasing skirts is the way of all men, some just have more boldness than others. But, not all men can spend days on end buried in their studies. Especially not with a mortal body. Delia froze, the whetstone she was using to sharpen her sword radiated a crisp metallic sound. Libro smiled knowingly, if he doesn't die first, you may not be stronger than him for too long. You all heard it, he could have taken the slight the pillar heads prepared for him with a lowered head and a closed mouth, yet he didn't. Determination is exactly what you need to be strong. Maying's eyes sparkled with interest. She knew her friend better than anyone else and was well aware Delia felt somewhat indignant for Diane as well. But, when it came to the matters of the martial world, there was also not many people who understood its cruelty more than Delia. You're going to need to be honest with yourself, you know you're a softie. You've been trying to be someone you aren't since your mom went missing. It hurts me that all I can do is watch from the side. Maybe running away from new relationships is exactly what you don't need. Maying thought to herself. It was quite baffling. It seemed that the one who looked to be the most childish amongst them was maybe the most mature. Libro turned to a monitor with a pensive look on his face. All he saw was static. the interference wasn't allowing him to see into the room. It seems like his technology is quite interesting. Let's hope he's okay. Madeline curiously observed the few who were the closest to her. Her blood brother, two young girls she saw as her own little sisters, her blood uncle. Each and every one of them was somehow thinking about a mortal boy who had only just appeared in their lives. Logically, he should have been nothing more than a blip, but he already had such a hold on them. She couldn't help but to be curious. She wondered if her path would ever cross with this Diane Sacharo. Chapter 15. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Diane yawned, his eyes slowly opening to the expansive blue of Focus Lake. He had to admit that the scenery here was quite beautiful. He felt that his mortal world should definitely consider building more underwater structures like this. Remembering the events of the past few days, though, Diane's gaze grew cold. If the others who had known him as a skirt-chasing joker saw him now, it would be hard to say if they'd recognize him at all. Jumping out of bed, the coldness in Diane's eyes seemed to vanish as he clapped his hands together. I am so hungry. After taking a quick shower, Diane threw on some black sweats and a new white tee. He rolled up his sweats to about mid-calf, then hopped back onto his bed. Flicking his wrists, he, as fast as his hands would allow, pulled out a week's worth of food and started eating. Soon afterwards, Diane patted his stomach and let out a satisfied burp. He fell backwards onto his bed, feeling refreshed. Alright, first things first, I'll have to figure out how to fix this speed reading technique problem before reading the books on arrays. I suspect Libro didn't give me the full technique. If the Sapientia family was so generous, they wouldn't force all research to be under their name. Not to mention, I wouldn't have seen so many students reading books the normal way in the library. Libro had no way of knowing that Diane would be able to see through him with such a simple deduction. Who knew how he'd react if he knew? Diane pushed himself up and crossed his legs, meditating on the matter. He had gotten in the habit of meditation due to his father. His old man was always a stoic and quiet one, the kind of military man who didn't seem to know how to smile. But, he had taught Diane many things before his death, things Diane would never forget. Of course, there were quite a few things Diane ignored as well. His father was a man who always emphasized the importance of hierarchy and listening to your superiors. Unfortunately, his son was too headstrong to even consider doing any of that. It wasn't long after Lionel started his meditation that he realized something astonishing. That's odd. The books I read seem to be organized just like regular memories would be. Don't tell me that sleep was the answer, that makes no sense. Diane thought of many possibilities. Did he have a breakthrough in cultivation? Did the technique just take time to take proper effect? Or maybe it really was sleep. But he didn't find any of the answers to be suitable. The speed reading technique, from Diane's understanding, was a low-level soul technique. Low-level soul techniques were exceedingly more complex than regular energy or body cultivation methods because the soul was an enigma for many in the martial arts world. That thought alone seemed to remove the possibility of a breakthrough in cultivation resulting in his now more organized memory of the plants. The spontaneous breakthrough of the soul. If Diane even thought of mentioning this, he'd get laughed out of any room. All signs pointed toward the technique just needing time, but something was telling Diane that it wasn't that simple. An incomplete technique wouldn't find itself whole that easily, and that was the main problem. Diane assumed the issue stemmed from the incomplete technique, so it suddenly being perfect now was just odd. Thinking to this point, Diane decided not to waste unnecessary thoughts on something he didn't have enough information on, another one of his father's teachings. So, he decided to begin speed reading the books on arrays to test the technique some more. Maybe this time he would be able to see what changes there might be and come to a better conclusion. Hundreds of books appeared in Diane's room. After reaching for the first, his body trembled with another astonishing discovery. It's much faster than before. And, it's already part of my memories. Diane was astounded, and he had every right to be. The reason he started with the plant books was because they were much simpler, and much less about theories and abstract concepts. A book on plants simply pointed out the unique characteristics of the plants, what it could be used for, and what properties you would want or avoid when mixing it with other plants. The more complex books simply detailed the plant's information to the cellular level to give an array alchemist the most in-depth overview possible. This was in fact the most important aspect of grasping plant grafting. But, array theory was many times more complex. It was often the reason why there were no real array alchemists in Focus Academy. Not only were the concepts beyond the scope of what most could understand, Diane had just found out that it had insane requirements for the soul and even required a trait most martial artists didn't have. The Aurora. This was all to say that since array theory books were much more complex, it should have taken him longer to get through a single book. But, somehow, it took him less than a single minute. Unfortunately for Diane, even though this should have been great news for him, the information about this so-called Aurora was brand new to him. Damn it, if I had known array theory had such strict requirements, I would have chosen another faction. Awakening this mind's eye nonsense requires so many resources. If I had this much money, I wouldn't be joining such a run-down faction. I'd be traveling the martial world looking for the best cultivation methods. Diane almost felt like flipping a table. The more he learned about the mind's eye, the more he wanted to shed tears. This mind's eye would be so useful: increased insight to wills, access to a sixth sense, upgraded intelligence, not to mention, it would make soul cultivation so much easier. Maybe I could one day triple cultivate soul, body and energy. Diane suddenly froze. Slap. Diane's hand slapped his forehead. I am such an idiot. Mind's eye, soul cultivation, my unexplained increased efficiency in speed reading, the technique suddenly becoming whole. Maybe. Diane dove into the piles of books, seemingly looking for one in particular. Ah, here it is. Diane held a book up called Awakening Your Aurora for Dummies. Diane shook his head. Seems like the martial world steals things from the human world too. Diane was a bit confused at first by the title, but he then found out after speed reading the book that mind's eye was a colloquial term for aurora. They were interchangeable. The book was broken up into two sections. An awakening section, and a sensing section. The more Diane read, the brighter his gaze became. I see. So, innate auroras are possible as well. Those with innate auroras experience a smoother path and greater talent in soul cultivation. But, according to the book, the heavens are fair. If you think you've been snubbed, awaken your own aurora and challenge the skies. So, the question is, was my mind's eye innate, or did something else awaken it? One way to find out: Diane placed the book down and kept his eyes closed, focusing on an abstract inner world. A golden flame flooded his senses. He seemed to sense everything in the room even without his eyes. It was almost as if this sense was a superior one, making all others obsolete. Gold. Having an innate soul was just a 1 in 5 chance. But, an innate aurora. Even amongst a billion, there might not even be a single one. This gold light that flooded Diane's senses. This was exactly the marker of the pinnacle talent of the soul. Diane clenched his fists tighter. His body might be weak and his energy cultivation talent might be poor, but his soul stood above on a plane of its own. It seemed he finally had some capital to stand in this world. Chapter 16. You are listening at novelfull.audio. When Diane calmed, he came to a realization. A golden hue in one's aurora denoted an innate one, whereas a white light denoted a forcibly awakened one. The fact that Diane's aurora had already awoken meant that he had had his aurora before even coming to the academy. Now that he thought about it, that had to be the only way he managed to enter the academy at all. Since the mortal world and martial world shared a planet, they had some loose relations. One of their traditions was the testing of willing participants to be taken into the martial world. Without suspense, all failed. It was simply impossible for a mortal to be born with cultivation talent. So, as the years passed, the tradition became more of a formality than anything else. In fact, no small number of people made fun of those who even cared to continue trying to pass this test of talent. Eventually, those even deemed to try were looked down upon. That was until Diane somehow managed to break a failure streak that had lasted hundreds of years. Remembering these memories, Diane couldn't help but sigh, a rare somber expression on his face. "Are you doing all right, Clara?" Diane furiously shook his head, trying to shed himself of such thoughts. Clearing his mind, he managed to regain his focus. In all his excitement, Diane had forgotten to even consider what level of strength his soul had reached. He had originally assumed that he was simply at the lowest level, but that was when he remembered that he had an innate soul. The most common types of innate souls were ones birthed into the lower foundation stage. Of the 20% of people who would be born with such a soul, over 90% of them would be born at this stage. Diane wasn't sure if he was among this 90% or not. Unfortunately, Diane was having a harsh time gauging his level. Unlike the foundation stage for energy cultivation, which had very clear and obvious dividing lines, the path for soul cultivation seemed to be more arbitrary. I might be able to deduce my true level by another method. For example, if there's an array that can only be drawn with a certain level of strength. Diane nodded to himself, this would theoretically be possible. The only issue was that Diane didn't know how to draw any arrays just yet. It felt like there was just one headache after another. As though that wasn't already bad enough. If it was hard to find energy cultivation methods, it's going to be even harder to find soul cultivation ones. How am I even going to improve from now on? Diane had finally deduced the reason speed reading had become easier to him. His soul had grown in strength. If he understood correctly, it was likely because he had drained himself completely using the speed reading technique previously. After sleeping, his soul naturally grew. This was a similar concept to body weight training, except for the soul. The good news was that this affirmed Diane's talent. The bad news was that doing things this way was much slower than having a real technique. This left him with yet another dilemma. Diane's brows furrowed. He kept running into roadblocks. Wait a minute, maybe array theory can tide me over for the time being. My aurora is powerful and I have array explanations up to the 9th common grade, only a step away from the practitioner array alchemist ranks. If I'm able to master some of these arrays, I'll have some capital to defend myself and I'll simultaneously be able to deduce what level my soul is at. The secondary profession grades, at least as far as Focus Academy was concerned, was split into common grade, practitioner grade, and finally, master grade. Common grade professionals were able to make suitable pills, formations and weapons, depending on the profession, of course, for foundational stage warriors. The first common grade could make things for first foundational stage warriors and so on. So, Diane got to work. Unfortunately, what he didn't know was that the soul wasn't very conducive to battle. Many used it as a supplement, but it was never the main source of combat strength. The soul was simply too fragile. But, even if Diane did know this, what other choice did he have? As soon as he read his first book on the martial world, Diane had already decided to become the ever-elusive perfect expert who practiced all three martial doctrines: body, soul and energy. Originally, his plan was to begin with the conventional energy method, because body and soul cultivators were in the heavy minority, so he had conceded that it would only be realistic if he were to start with energy. But now, everything was different. He couldn't start on the crazy plan he had pushed to the back of his mind. That said, Diane wasn't exactly at a loss. Unknowingly, by ignoring the energy cultivation path for now, he was helping himself. To be the perfect martial artist, you had to start with the perfect base. But, unfortunately, no one could because of eroding talent one would experience as one aged. The foundation stage was about preparing your body to accept greater forms of energy from the higher stages of cultivation. But, because martial talent eroded as people aged, most were forced to begin cultivating before their bodies fully matured. The result was that their foundations weren't as solid as they could be. This was the unfortunate trade-off for having higher martial talent during cultivation. Those from really large sects and academies could partially fix these faulty foundations with exotic fruits and pills. They would both begin to cultivate early and consume these fruits to offset the deficiency of their youthful bodies. But they'd never be the perfect selves they could have been. That said, there also existed another group. True geniuses believed in themselves. They tempered their wills, deepened their understandings of secondary occupations and cultivation, delved into their auras, and sharpened their understanding of battle without cultivating. These geniuses didn't begin energy cultivating until they were 13 or older, some not even until they reached their peak levels of physical maturity at 18. Those that waited until their bodies matured at 18 were the greatest geniuses the martial world had to offer. While the strength between a mortal 5-year-old and a mortal 18-year-old might seem negligible to martial artists, only the ignorant would think this. Cultivation is about exponential increases based on your foundation. Even a marginally better foundation would lead to massively large strength differences among martial artists. If you couple this with the special physiques these geniuses were born with and tempering that pushed the mortal body to the limit, the peak of these patient geniuses is unassailable to the normal. Dian had unknowingly stepped into a realm only the peak-level geniuses of the martial world would even think of attempting to join. But the problem was, those geniuses had unshakable sects and clans backing them, while Dian could only rely on himself. And that's where array alchemy became his hope. Not only would it allow him to better temper his wills because of his aurora, it would also earn him the money he'd need to temper his body to peak form and make up for his weak mortal upbringing. How fascinating! To reach the best foundation in energy cultivation, patience is needed, but it doesn't seem like the same is true of soul and body cultivation. A gleam could be seen in Dian's eyes as he greedily sped through all of the books Libro had lent him. By the time he was finished, the once bright blue in his room had become dark and he could no longer see up to the surface of the lake. By that point, Dian was absolutely certain. His soul had somehow already reached the peak of the foundation stage, something that would shock the elders of Focus Academy should they know about it. But, despite the good news, he had a frown on his face. Chapter 17 You are listening at novelfull.audio. Damn it, how am I supposed to protect myself with arrays if the normal time to set one up exceeds multiple hours for most? It only took Dian a day to run into the second reason soul cultivators were so weak in battle. No one was going to sit and wait for you to finish drawing your arrays. Many needed special materials to be completed, especially large-scale ones. As for ones that didn't require any materials, they were always much weaker than those that could be built with them. To make matters worse, even if the array didn't need materials, it would not only be weaker, but that wouldn't change the fact the time needed would still be far too long to be used in battle. This is ridiculous. Every time I think I have a solution, a new problem appears. Who's going to wait for me to set up an array during battle? I could technically preemptively set them up, but that leads to too many variables. Plus, they dissipate over time. Mine might last longer than the usual due to my innate aurora, but it still won't last forever. If I run out in battle, it'll be the death of me. This split minds technique I found might help, but it doesn't cut the time down by enough. But, this time, Dian didn't allow himself to get frustrated. He had created many things in the human world. This was why the Pillar family leaders knew they couldn't kill him openly without starting a war. The hovering board, the protective disc, the cleansing pill, were all creations from his own school of thought. So, now, he just had to do it again. This wasn't a problem of lacking information. Rather, this time, he had all the information he needed, he just needed to find a new way to manipulate it. This was exactly what Dian did best. Really, Dian? You're about to try to create a new branch in a school of thought that has existed for millions of years. You're quite bold. Diane said to himself while a bright smile appeared on his face. He seemed to be reprimanding himself, but his grin told a different story. Arrays might be complex and abstract, but no more so than a computer program would be. It's just a complex series of commands written via a different medium than I'm used to. Just like some code is more efficient than others, I can rework arrays that have been written in an overly complex language and simplify it. Like writing an essay with just the thesis or writing a sentence with just a word. This sounded ridiculous in the context of a normal language. But, when it came to coding, it happened all the time. What an inexperienced and untalented coder might take 100 lines to write could be done in just 10 by a true elite. Diane closed his eyes in contemplation. He knew this would be difficult, and he obviously couldn't do this with every array formation. As his aurora increased in strength along with his soul, he'd be able to draw more complex ones faster. But, for now, he had to focus on the simpler arrays so that speed could be ensured. The bad news was that this meant that Diane wouldn't be able to draw Tier 9 common grade arrays despite the fact his soul was powerful enough to do so. But, he couldn't very well win every battle, right? Everything came with give and take. If Diane wanted speed now, he would have to give up strength. This was the only way he would be able to protect himself. To be viable in battle, I need to be able to draw the array in my mind's eye and cast it in fractions of a second. If I recall the speed Big Ava cracked her whip with, I need to at least be able to react to something like that. If others heard Diane's thoughts, they would think he was crazy. Ava wasn't just an upper-year student, she was an elite amongst them. To expect to accomplish such a thing as a first year. Well, it was ridiculous. However, Diane's mind continued to churn. Surprisingly, there are quite a few I might be able to pull this off with, but let's begin with 3. A defensive array, an amplification array and a hardening array. I'll focus on their Tier 1 common grade versions for now, then work my way up. Lay a foundation, then build. This is the way the best code is built. I can make up for their lack of power by stacking them if need be. With the defensive array I'll be able to have some extra defense and I'll be able to step into the air to escape if necessary if I use them like stairs. With the amplification array I can up my speed and power, but since that would be limited by the durability of my body, I'll have to use the hardening array to reduce the stress on my bones and muscles. Diane believed that the trifecta of these 3 would allow him the flexibility he needed in battle. The first thing Diane did, before even attempting to simplify the arrays, was to take out large sheets of paper and draw them out. He tried multiple times before he perfected the changes in intensity and intent through each stroke. The sun was already high in the sky by the time he had finished, and he surprisingly wasn't tired. Seems like my increased soul strength had some extra benefits too, Diane thought with a smile. 3 large sheets of paper hung from his walls as Diane looked them over. A smirk emerged on his face as his eyes flashed with enlightenment. Before he worked on his simplified arrays, a cold light flashed through Diane's eyes as he thought of something else. There was only one rule in the martial world. Just one that dictated every and anything. Everything by absolute power or absolute sympathy. This was the mantra of Focus Academy and a line that stuck with Diane. Remembering it now as he was on the precipice of grasping strength of his own was truly telling. In that case, I'll grasp the things I want with my own strength, Diane said with a mysterious glint in his eyes. He looked through his dark window towards the center pillar. Sympathy. Was he, Diane Sacharo, a man who would wait for such a thing? First, I'll take all your money. Then, I'll sneak into your off-limits library since there's no rules, right? Then, I'll kill your so-called geniuses. I'll turn your school upside down and crush anyone who gets in my way. One would never think that Diane was a child who was raised in the mortal world. He spoke of killing as though it was just another action, the thought of one day having to do so didn't even faze him. The walls of this school seemed to want to crash down around him, but only time would tell who would be crushing who. To him, this place was nothing but a stepping stone. The windows groaned as a cold killing intent filled the room. The look in his eyes was demonic. The air was heavy and the atmosphere dark. Then, it all disappeared. A smile once again appeared on Diane's face as he focused himself back towards his arrays. I think I'll this new form of array alchemy. Speed arraying, Diane said with a light chuckle. With a flick of his wrist, he began to fill his walls with the calculations of a madman. Chapter 18. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Diane walked out of his room with his classic sweats and tea. The clicking of his flip-flops followed him as he walked through the hallway. He easily ignored the weird looks he was getting. Thinking back to the map of the school he had memorized, he knew that the Array Alchemy faction should be in a small corner on the library side of the Pasha, Neva pillar. Ridiculous. Usual pillar factions have an entire floor to themselves, maybe even multiple floors, but they get a small corner. Diane walked to the library to find the usual large desk and massive black monitor. As he was about to walk past it, a flash caught his eye as the monitor flicked on. I was wondering if you were dead, you know, said Libro with a massive smile on his face. Me? Dead? Never, Diane grinned, plus it's only been a few days. Did you miss me so much? A few days. It's been almost 3 weeks. You must have really been out of it. Diane started. 3 weeks. Did I sleep for longer than I thought I did? Who knows how long it took for my soul to improve like it did? That seems to be the only explanation. Otherwise, it wouldn't possibly take that long. Diane recovered quickly though. Maybe I was busy figuring out how to complete the incomplete technique you gave me. A mysterious smile creeped across his face. You. Interesting, it seems I've underestimated you yet again. Libro shook his head. He should stop giving such a monster any boundaries at all. Of course, he would have realized the technique was incomplete. It was a simple deduction if he thought about it. You'd be surprised how proficient I am now. I can even speed read multiple books at a time if I spread my consciousness. Spread your consciousness. Libro looked at Diane in confusion before a sudden realization hit him. Innate aurora, the sixth sense. Monster. This was the only way to gain sixth sense so early on. Maybe Diane wasn't even aware of what he was saying. Usually, sixth sense would only appear after. Libro shook his head, not even wanting to think about it. But this young man is still 2NA.VE. If he goes around flaunting his abilities so wildly, there'll only be 2 possible outcomes. Either he's dismissed as a lunatic, or he'll be dissected like a lab rat. What Libro didn't know was that considering Diane's personality, even if he knew how rare his abilities were, he would probably flaunt them even more. Before Libro could even speak again, Diane had already waved goodbye and leaped over the desk, too lazy to walk around it. Walking to the further corner of the library, Libro found a door with a shabby sign above it reading Array Alchemy Faction. He lightly knocked and waited patiently. A while went by, so Diane decided to knock again, but before he could, the door swung open. A disheveled man appeared wearing a worn-out red elder's robe. His hair was erratic and charred black in some places, but you could barely tell that burnt portions from the normal brunette color. His beard was massive, but somehow not long. Coupled with his hair, it was almost like his face was encased in a sphere of burnt hair. If you really focused, you could tell he was a lot younger than he seemed to be. But, his disposition was that of an old eccentric despite probably not being much older than 30 years old. Eli. You've grown taller. I thought you were already here. Diane had a weird look on his face as he looked at the man he assumed headed the Array Alchemy faction. No, Senior, I'm Diane. I came to join. Join. An incredulous look passed through the elder's face. Almost as if he had never heard something so ridiculous. But, he quickly recovered. 2 first years want to join. This must be a blessing from the heavens. Come, come. I've been in need of help for so long. Dian awkwardly scratched the back of his head before following the elder in. Seems like the Array Alchemist faction needs even more help than I thought. The inside of the faction was a mess of paper, inks and torn-up plants. The room was about double the size of Dian's, but for an entire faction, it seemed lackluster. In the corner, Dian found a skinny boy picking seeds off of withered plants and dropping them into a crafted basket. Dian didn't need to guess much to know that this young man must have been the Eli that weird elder mentioned. Dian could only imagine how the latter managed to confuse him for this scrawny boy when they had been in the same room together just now. Eli wiped sweat off of his brow before looking up. A look of surprise flashed across his face. He seemed to be in complete shock that another person would actually appear here. It looked like he hadn't been tricked into coming to this place and was actually aware of what he had gotten himself into. Dian smiled. What a weird faction. The student is here, but the elder got the door. I might like it here. I'm here to help in whatever way I can. Elder, sorry senior, I'm not sure of your name. The elder waved his hands while looking down at his notes. Don't call me elder. You can just call me Uncle Ale, that's what Eli calls me. Dian clasped his hands respectfully. It's nice to meet you, Uncle Ale. Dian then turned toward Eli and stretched out a hand. Hello, you can call me Dian. Eli somewhat shyly stretched out a hand. He panicked when he realized his palm was covered in ink and plant juices, but Dian didn't mind as he clasped down before Elite could retreat. Dian grinned. We're both men, there's no need to worry about such petty things. Eli smiled bashfully. If Dian didn't know better, he would think that Eli was a girl in disguise. But, with his newfound sixth sense, he was certain that this wasn't a beauty. Dian chuckled. He didn't mind that Eli was so reserved. Dian was a person who always acted on his first instinct. He did as he pleased, hated as he wished and loved as his loins dictated. At least that was what he liked to think. Either way, Eli's pure disposition was quite to his liking. Maybe it was because of the harsh reality this academy had been slapping him with ever since he came here, but he liked the idea of a person without schemes. Yes. You can call me Eli. Eli squeezed out. Though, he was immediately embarrassed since Uncle Ale had already introduced him. Dian laughed, not minding at all. Uncle Ale gazed toward Dian, his gaze surprisingly clear at that moment. Compared to his original bumbling self, this was a striking contrast. He wondered if this young man really knew what it meant to join this faction. Chapter 19. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Uncle Ale shook his head and smiled. We haven't had many members at all, and we don't have much to offer. But, we'll be a family here. I won't tolerate any nonsense. It takes years of study to succeed here. It'll be slow. But, if you work hard, you'll see that there's no other secondary occupation that can compare. We're defenders, healers, and fighters. We're romantics, demons, and gods. There is no comparison. A blacksmith can only forge. An herb expert's best use is in their tea. A beast tamer spends their time in shit-filled stalls. There is no occupation as noble or as important as ours. Uncle Ale looked up with a serious expression, almost as if to tell Dian he meant every word he said. He was pleasantly surprised to not find any disbelief in Dian's eyes. Since Dian had decided to do something, it would of course have to be the best. He didn't find Uncle Ale's words to be too over the top at all, though he did feel the old, or rather middle-aged man was more eccentric than even he had assumed initially. This wasn't because of Uncle Ale's determination, but rather because his choice of words just felt stale. Almost as though he had been teleported from 20 years in the past and hadn't quite caught up with today's language just yet. Uncle Ale, not knowing Dian's true thoughts, felt very pleased with himself as he continued. Tell me about your experience so I can see where I should start you off at. Eli has quite a bit of understanding about plants because of his family, so he can already be considered half a first common level array alchemist. That meaning that he has all the necessary knowledge for the alchemy portion, but not the array portion. Although his plant knowledge surpasses the first common level, he hasn't met the other requirements. Diane pondered for a bit. I have read and memorized every book on plants and arrays in this school. So, my knowledge should cover up to the fifth common level of array alchemy. I've awakened my aurora and can also form my aurora flame already as well. Oh, and I'm proficient with 3 first common level arrays. The aurora flame was a special construct of the aurora and could be considered to be the manifestation of its energy. Unlike other flames, the aurora flame didn't have any intrinsically offensive properties, nor was it even hot. Depending on the wielder, an aurora flame would have many potential abilities called characteristics. That said, a universal characteristic of the aurora flame was its healing characteristic. It was this characteristic that allowed array alchemists to splice and mend together herbs without issue. Diane looked up from his thoughts to find Uncle Ale and Eli looking at him like he was some sort of zoo animal. "Which family do you come from?" Uncle Ale was under the impression that Diane was just a commoner. What noble from a prestigious family would ever come to their faction? But, it was easier to believe that Diane was from some prominent family than to believe he could awaken his aurora and aurora flame without guidance. Just the expense required alone would be astronomical. Even Uncle Ale had only partially opened his aurora to this point. Diane smiled and said nothing. Instead, he flicked his wrists, letting 3 complex arrays spin across the top of his hands. "What kind of nonsense is this? Are you trying to play tricks with my eyes? I'm not as old as I look, you know." Eli tugged on Diane's shirt and whispered, "You shouldn't use array plates to try and fool Uncle Ale, Diane. His eyes are sharp." Eli quickly tried to help Diane. They were the only 2 students in this faction and he didn't want to lose a potential friend so quickly. He knew his uncle's temperament and Ale most definitely wouldn't allow Diane to keep playing around like this. "Array plates. Of course, you're using array plates," Uncle Ale said in disgust. "How else could you form arrays so quickly? If you want to flaunt your riches, do so somewhere else. I only accept those who are serious about learning." Diane came to a sudden realization. "Oh, I understand." Instead of speaking further, Diane placed his hands in front of him and his eyes flashed with a golden light. "What?" "Innate aurora," Eli whispered in agitation. A complex array began forming in front of Diane. Lights swirled as the gentle hum of soul energy filled the air. The lines thickened and thinned. They crossed and diverged. The starting point of the drawing seemed to come from 8 separate origins, almost as if 8 minds were working on finishing the array together. This, the split minds drawing technique. He's barely past 16, how is he doing this? With this technique, at least I won't need to stand for hours doing one formation. I can only split my mind 8 ways for now, but hopefully I'll be able to do more in the future. Half an hour later, the hum ceased and a deathly quiet filled the room. But, before anyone could comment, chimes that seemed to come from the heavens resonated with the array. The array began to shake with happiness, bowing to thank its maker. It's the perfection realm. Uncle Ale didn't know if his eyes and ears were deceiving him, but he seemed to get younger by 10 years. His eyes shone with a bright light he hadn't had in decades. When an array perfectly resonated with heaven's intent, the bells of the realm of perfection rang. This wasn't held to just array alchemy, this occurred for every secondary occupation when a task was complete to such an extent. Although Diane only received 1 chime, and it was restricted to just a few kilometers, the fact he used the split mind technique and just his age alone, in fact, was enough to shock anyone. Outside the room, the whole school vibrated in resonance with the chime. Everyone looked up, having no idea where this was coming from. Pasha, Neva looked up from his desk, a look of disbelief coming across his face. Delia wiped sweat off her brow while holding her sword steady, trying to feel the vibrations of the chime. "Who was it?" Madeline looked past her uncle and to the monitor, watching Diane's golden-hued eyes with curiosity. A smile crossed her fairy-dot-like features as no one could tell what she was thinking. Libro closed his eyes and shook his head. Monster. For those brief moments, the entire academy seemed to have come to a grinding halt. Everyone basked in the beautiful sound, wondering just who it was had succeeded in the impossible. Back in the room, Uncle Ale and Eli looked happy beyond words. This is the resurrection of our faction. Uncle Ale stood in agitation. Although you haven't been officially recognized by an Array Alchemy Guild, your level of expertise is at the very least at the peak of the first common level. And that's probably an underestimation. Eli couldn't hold back his smile. For some reason, he felt very happy right now. It was only long after the two calmed that Uncle Ale began to ask questions. Wait, if you could do that, why would you use array plates? Questioned Uncle Ale. It's not good to rely on them, you know. Diane scratched his head awkwardly. I didn't use an array plate. I just simplified the array so I could draw it in the least amount of time. I can't afford a good cultivation technique right now, so I wanted to learn array alchemy to protect myself. The look on Uncle Ale's face was priceless. He shook his head as his lips trembled into a bitter smile. I guess it's really true. Not everyone is born equal. You geniuses will be the end of me. Diane raised an eyebrow. He had a feeling Uncle Ale wasn't talking about him anymore. Uncle Ale shook his head. It's such a shame to waste such a well-made formation, regardless of the fact it only took you a half hour to make. Here, Uncle Ale handed Diane a formation plate. Diane looked up in surprise. Then a grin spread across his face. This should sell for quite a lot, right, Uncle Ale? Let's turn the school upside down. Uncle Ale looked at Diane like he was looking at a monster. But then he smiled too. It seems like the heavens haven't forgotten about our little faction. Chapter 20. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ava. Hello. A small hand waved in front of Ava's blue eyes. Oh, hey. What were you saying? Ava and a girl about her age sat at a cafeteria table together, talking amongst each other. Well, it seemed that the girl spent quite a lot of time talking, but Ava seemed to be absent-minded. Still, even in such a state, her tight leather clothing made the boys and even some girls in the area steal several glances. The girl gave Ava a weird look. You've been out of it for a while. I was trying to tell you about my cultivation manual. I suggest you switch. The foundation stage is all about preparing your body to sustain the influx of energy that comes with the meridian formation stage, but how could you expect my dainty body to accept so much extra muscle? Can't I be a martial artist and stay elegant at the same time? It's like the martial gods have no remorse for the feelings of women. I asked Elder Lena for help and she suggested a change for me. The muscle you gain is much less obvious, but the trade-off is that surpassing the third and fourth layer is much harder. You know, the first layer is building strength and the second is about building flesh, so this cultivation method spends less on those, and the trade-off is more time spent building your bones and marrow. I could use some extra oomph in my hip bones. I'm trying to be as curvy as you. Hey. Are you listening? The girl, who had begun to ramble again, realized that Ava had grown dazed once more. Oh, yeah, I was listening. What if you become big bone though? Don't be ridiculous, the technique is about increasing bone density and durability. It's just changing the matter that makes up bones, size won't change noticeably. I was joking about my hips, the girl sighed. Something big must have happened for you to be so out of it. Tell your bestie, who do I have to beat up? Stop it, Tammy, it's nothing like that. I was just thinking about Darius and his antics recently. Darius Storm. I heard that someone was ballsy enough to provoke him. Some first year, if I remember correctly. Ava sighed. He's from a family I've never heard of, honestly. Diane Sicharo. Have you heard of him? If Diane had been there, he would have been stunned. He had long since forgotten about this Darius person and had no idea the latter was looking for him. And not only that, apparently the news had been spread quite far. Sacharo. None of the Marshall families that go to this school share that family name, I don't think. Tammy's eyes glazed over in thought. Oh. But I did hear a rumor the other day. A rumor? What about? I hear the academy accepted a student from the human world, Tammy said in a hushed voice. The human world. That would explain a lot. So, the rumor is true. Well, I think so. He had all of this weird technology I've never seen before. Even a weird disc that stopped about 50% of my strength without a scratch. 50%. Tammy said in shock. That's not even the end of it. The reason I think you're right is because he had no cultivation whatsoever. Even those from the weakest of families have at least stepped into the lower tier of the first foundation layer, but he showed no signs of ever having practiced a cultivation method. He's completely green. To come to an academy like this with no cultivation, no backing, and no idea what's going on. He has a death wish. The idiot almost dipped his hand into one of the energy ponds. If it wasn't for me, he'd be dead, twice over. A hint of a peculiar light flashed in Tammy's gaze when she heard about Diane's pond incident. Was there really someone so stupid? Twice over. You must have saved him from Darius too, Tammy giggled. You're soft. I didn't know you had a thing for commoners. Ava glared at her friend. Stop it. He's handsome, sure. But there are plenty of handsome guys here. Looking good isn't going to help you when you're lying in the ground, dead. Ava looked away when she said this, seemingly trying to think of guys as handsome. But, she actually drew a blank. Luckily, Tammy hadn't seemed to notice. Tammy giggled. There's the cold-hearted Ava I know and love. It's already been 3 weeks and I haven't seen him since. That idiot hasn't even shown up to any of his classes and there's already an examination coming up soon. I really don't know what he's thinking. This wasn't normal school. If teachers hated you in Focus Academy, it could very well cost you your life. This was especially so if you had no backing. A mere commoner daring to skip classes. Which teacher would accept that? A serious look suddenly flashed across Tammy's face, abruptly stopping her laughter as though she suddenly remembered something. The tournament is coming up in a few months, you know. Ava, are you going this time? I know you're strong enough to make it into those big sects. You need to stop holding yourself back because of him. A sad look appeared on Ava's face. He's my brother. I can't just forget about him. 4th years don't just die like that, Tammy. You know my brother was strong enough to make it into the big sects too. In fact, he already had multiple offers. But, he chose to stay here to perfect his wills to a new level because of that place in the center pillar. I know I'm not strong enough to go there yet, but I have to find out what happened. Tears glistened in Ava's eyes, threatening to fall, but she fought them off. I will find out. Tammy looked at the determination in her friend's eyes. I just don't want you to lose so many years of your life. Promise me that you won't spend a 3rd year here. Promise me that you'll participate in the tournament and let those big sects see that you and your big brother are special. A troubled look flashed across Ava's face. She knew her friend was right. People die in the martial world all the time, not everyone could have a proper burial. She just never thought her brother would be one too. He used to be a shining light in their family, but now. All right. I promise. This is the last year I'll spend looking. A smile appeared on Tammy's small face. Her blue eyes and blonde hair bobbed together in excitement. All right, now let's get to the fun stuff. The Pillar family seniors are hosting a party for their juniors and of course you and I are invited. You because you're a top ranked and I because I'm obviously ridiculously beautiful. How could you have a party without me? It's in a week and I forbid you to wear leather. Let's go to buy peek and look at some dresses. Maybe we can find a cheongsam to match those outrageous curves of yours, Tammy said, pulling her friend along. Ava shook her head in exasperation, but in the end, she just giggled and allowed herself to enjoy the moment.